The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit minus 10 degrees Celsius before most families in the Bitterroot Valley had finished stacking their last cord of wood. The sky that morning carried the color of iron, the kind of gray that old-timers read as a warning, not a forecast. Snow hadn't come yet, but the ground was already rigid underfoot, and the creek near the southern tree line had gone silent under a thin skin of ice. Anyone riding the trail east of the Larson homestead that week would have noticed something odd pressed against the far side of a small cabin near the tree line. It wasn't a barn. It wasn't a proper lean-to. It was low, curved, and covered partly in canvas and partly in packed dirt, a half-buried arch, no taller than a man's chest, attached to the cabin's north wall, like a growth nobody could identify. The man who built it had been told, politely at first, and then with considerably less politeness, to find himself somewhere else to winter. He had no deed to the land. He had no seasoned timber. He had no money that anyone took seriously. What he had was a pile of bent scrap iron rods salvaged from a collapsed supply depot, a canvas tarp, and a problem he needed to solve before the first real blizzard arrived. What he understood about heat, about wood, air, and cold, was about to make every cord of firewood stacked by his better-supplied neighbors look like a very expensive mistake. If you've ever wondered how frontier settlers survived brutal winters with almost nothing, stay with this video. Because what this man built for under $10 outperformed cabins that cost 10 times more. Like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Every week, we bring you a real technique from the frontier that actually worked when lives depended on it. His name in local accounts appears only as the Norwegian hand from the Bozeman Mill, a sawmill laborer who had spent 2 seasons felling timber near the Clark Fork River before a wage dispute and a harsh word from a foreman left him without employment in early October of 1887. Oral histories from the valley, recorded by a local schoolteacher some years later, describe him as a compact, quiet man somewhere in his late 30s, with hands like sanded oak and the unhurried movements of someone who had learned not to waste energy. He had not planned to winter in the Bitterroot. He had planned to travel south. But by the time October closed and the mountain passes tightened, he had spent most of his remaining wages on a mule that went lame 3 days after purchase, and his options had collapsed to one: find structure, any structure, and stay put. What he found was a one-room trapper's cabin at the edge of the settlement, half abandoned, the chinking between the logs loose and crumbling, the roof sound enough, but the floor bare dirt. The man who nominally owned the land gave him until freeze-up to vacate, but freeze-up came faster than either of them expected. By late October, the Norwegian hand was still there, and the landowner had moved on to more pressing concerns. The cabin's most urgent problem was not the cold itself. It was the wood. He had managed to cut and stack roughly 3 cords of timber from fallen trees along the creek, but it was all greenwood, freshly felled, still carrying 45 to 55% moisture content. Greenwood burns poorly. It smolders, produces enormous quantities of smoke, releases far less heat per log than seasoned timber, and leaves behind creosote that clogs flues and invites chimney fires. In a cabin with poor chinking and a basic stone fireplace, burning green wood through a Montana winter was less a heating strategy and more a slow surrender. He had watched his wood pile and done the arithmetic. It wasn't enough, not if it burned the way greenwood burns. Something had to change. The bent iron rods from the collapsed supply depot gave him the beginning of an answer. He hadn't gone looking for a solution. He had gone looking for scrap metal to reinforce the cabin's crumbling door frame. What he found instead was the skeleton of something he hadn't built yet. What he constructed over the following 9 days was, by any standard of the time, an unusual thing to build. He drove the bent iron rods into the ground along the north wall of the cabin, spacing them roughly 18 inches, 45 centimeters, apart, curving each one into an arch about 4 feet, 1.2 meters, high and 5 feet, 1.5 meters, wide at the base. He lashed them together at the crown with salvaged wire, then stretched the canvas tarp over the frame and weighted it down at the edges with stones and packed dirt. The result was a low, rounded tunnel, roughly 12 feet, 3.7 meters, long, pressed tight against the cabin's north wall, that local accounts describe as looking like a caterpillar had attached itself to the side of the house. Inside this structure, he stacked his green firewood. On the surface, this appears to solve nothing. The wood was wet. Covering it with canvas doesn't dry wood. Canvas isn't a kiln. Anyone who had spent a winter on the frontier could have told him that. And several did. But the Norwegian hand had worked in sawmills long enough to understand something about wood and air that most homesteaders didn't think about carefully. Green wood doesn't dry from cold. It dries from airflow and relative humidity difference, from air that is drier than the wood itself passing consistently over its surface. The arch structure created exactly that condition. The canvas, stretched tight over the iron frame and sealed at the edges with packed earth, created an enclosed air chamber above and around the stacked wood. During the day, even in late October, the sun warmed the canvas surface and raised the temperature inside the chamber by an estimated 15 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 to 14 degrees Celsius, above ambient. A modest gain, but consistent. More importantly, the chamber trapped the moisture that evaporated off the wood, then vented it slowly through a small, deliberate gap left at the peak of the arch. This gap, no wider than 3 fingers, created a passive thermal chimney effect. Warm, moist air rose and escaped at the top, while drier outside air was drawn in at the base. The north wall of the cabin itself acted as a secondary radiator. During the hours when the fire inside burned, the stone and log wall absorbed heat and re-emitted it slowly into the drying chamber, maintaining a slightly elevated temperature even after sundown. The total cost of materials. The iron rods were free salvage. The canvas tarp had cost him 60 cents the previous summer. The wire and stones cost nothing. By his own rough accounting, which local records suggest he shared later with the settlement's informal trading post operator, the entire structure came to somewhere between $8 and $12 in 1887 currency, the equivalent of roughly 3 to 4 days' wages at mill rates. It looked like a mistake. It looked like something a man builds when he doesn't know what he's doing. And for approximately 3 weeks, the people who passed the cabin on the trail treated it as exactly that. The settlement's most experienced builder, a German-born carpenter named Hofstetter, who had framed more than 40 structures across the valley over 15 years, rode past the cabin in the second week of November and pulled his horse up short when he saw the arch. He studied it for a moment from the saddle. Then he said, loudly enough that the Norwegian hand could hear from inside the cabin, that it was the most useless thing he had seen nailed to a building since a man in Missoula had tried to insulate his outhouse with pine boughs. That canvas will rot by January, Hofstetter said, and the wood inside will be wetter than when you started, because you've sealed the moisture in. He wasn't being cruel. He was, by the standards of his experience, being accurate. A sealed canvas cover over greenwood, with no active heat source and no understanding of the passive airflow the gap provided, would indeed trap moisture and accomplish nothing. Hofstetter's mental model of the structure was reasonable. His error was in assuming the gap at the peak didn't exist or didn't matter. The settlement's women who walked the trail to the creek had a different set of objections, primarily aesthetic. It doesn't look like a proper woodshed, one oral account records. It looks like he's trying to keep a secret under there. Someone with a sense of humor started calling it the Gopher Den. The name stuck for a while. The Norwegian hand, by all accounts, said very little in response. He kept his fire burning and his gap at the peak of the arch unobstructed, and he waited. By mid-November, the wood at the outer edges of his stack, the pieces with the most airflow exposure, had dropped visibly in weight. He could feel the difference when he lifted them. The ends had begun to check the small radial cracks that appear in wood as it loses moisture unevenly. That was a good sign. That was wood beginning to season. He said nothing about it to Hofstadter. November 22nd, 1887. The storm came from the northwest, and it did not announce itself politely. By mid-morning the temperature had fallen to -8 degrees Fahrenheit, -22 degrees Celsius, and was still dropping. The wind pushed horizontally across the valley in sustained gusts that local accounts estimate at 35 to 45 miles per hour, 56 to 72 kilometers per hour, driving fine dry snow through every gap in every structure that wasn't chinked to a near-perfect seal. It lasted 22 days. Not continuously at full intensity. There were quieter intervals, brief periods when the wind dropped and the temperature rose to a merciful 5 degrees Fahrenheit, -15 degrees Celsius. But the storm system that settled over the Bitterroot Valley in late November of 1887 was, by any reasonable measure, the test that the entire preceding autumn had been building toward. 3 families in the lower settlement ran into serious trouble within the first week. Their firewood, stacked in open-cord ricks in the traditional fashion, exposed to the wet and wind, had absorbed enough moisture from the October rains and early snow events that burning it required constant attention and produced inconsistent heat. 2 families resorted to burning fence posts. 1 family sent their eldest son on a 2-day round trip through the storm to purchase additional wood from a supply point 12 miles north. The Norwegian hand at the edge of the tree line did not send anyone anywhere. He reached into his drying arch, pulled out wood that had spent 6 weeks in a passive warm air chamber against a stone wall, and built his fire. Stay with me through the end of this video, because the number that comes next is what ended every argument about that canvas arch for good. The schoolteacher whose oral history records survive from this period, a practical woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who kept a detailed household journal, noted the comparative conditions of several cabins in the valley during the 3rd week of the blizzard with the methodical precision of someone who understood that such records might matter later. Her observations, combined with the Norwegian hand's own rough estimates, as recorded in the Trading Post ledger, produced the following picture. His firewood, after 6 weeks in the passive drying arch, had reached an estimated moisture content of 18 to 22%, low enough to be classified as adequately seasoned by the standards of the era. Wood at this moisture level ignites readily, burns with a consistent hot flame, and produces significantly less unburned particulate than greenwood. A cord of 20% moisture wood delivers roughly 30 to 35% more usable heat per volume than a cord at 45% moisture. Mrs. Aldrich noted that the Norwegian hand's fire required feeding approximately every 4 to 5 hours to maintain adequate warmth, less than half the rate of the Sorensen cabin, she wrote, which kept 2 men busy through the night. His interior cabin temperature, measured with a pocket thermometer she lent him during the storm's 2nd week, held between 58 degrees Fahrenheit and 64 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius to 18 degrees Celsius, during active burning hours, and dropped to approximately 42 degrees Fahrenheit to 46 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 degrees Celsius to 8 degrees Celsius, in the 6 to 8 hours after the fire died, before it needed rebuilding. By comparison, 2 neighboring cabins using greenwood from open-air cord stacks recorded overnight lows of 28 degrees Fahrenheit to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius to 1 degree Celsius, below freezing inside the structure or barely above it, and consumed wood at a rate nearly double his. The numbers were not miraculous. The physics were entirely straightforward. Drier wood burns better. A passive drying structure that costs under $10 and requires no maintenance produces drier wood. The arch had done exactly what the gap at its peak was designed to do: move air, carry moisture away, and use the warmth of the adjacent cabin wall to accelerate a process that nature would have accomplished in 12 months in the open. He had compressed a full year of seasoning into 6 weeks. By the end of the blizzard, he had consumed roughly 2.5 cords of his 3-cord stack. His neighbors, with equivalent stack sizes and larger cabins, had exhausted theirs completely or come close to it. One family had burned their spare furniture. Hofstetter, who rode past the cabin in early December after the worst of the storm had broken, did not stop to comment this time. The change in the valley's attitude was not sudden. It never is in communities where pride and practicality compete for the same territory. The first person who came to the Norwegian Hand with a direct question was not Hofstetter. It was one of the younger homesteaders, a man in his mid-20s who had spent the blizzard watching his carefully stacked open air wood pile lose fight after fight against the cold and the moisture. He arrived at the cabin in the first week of December, stood outside for a moment looking at the arch, and then asked, without preamble, how it worked. The Norwegian Hand showed him the gap at the peak, the spacing of the iron arches, the way the canvas needed to be tight but not sealed at the base, the positioning against the cabin wall for secondary heat. The whole explanation took less than 20 minutes. By the following autumn, local oral accounts describe at least 9 structures in the valley using some version of the same principle, not identical reproductions, because materials varied and every homesteader adapted to what was available, but all sharing the same core logic: an enclosed air chamber around the wood stack, a passive vent at the top, and a heat-absorbing wall surface nearby to maintain a temperature differential. Nobody called it a Quonset hut. That name wouldn't arrive for another half-century. Coined by the U.S. military during the Second World War for a mass-produced prefabricated arch shelter based on British Nissen hut technology. In the Bitterroot Valley in 1887, the structure the Norwegian Hand had built was called, depending on who you asked, the drying wrap, the Norwegian trick, or simply the arch. Hofstetter, it should be noted, built one before the following November. He made his from split cedar boards rather than salvaged iron rods. It lasted longer and looked considerably more respectable. He mentioned the Norwegian Hand's design to no one, as far as surviving records indicate, but the schoolteacher Mrs. Aldrich noted in her journal that she saw it going up and recognized immediately where the idea had come from. He wasn't stubborn, she wrote. He was practical. There is a difference, though it is not always easy to explain to a man who has built 40 houses and believe that experience is the same thing as knowledge. The Norwegian Hand left the Bitterroot Valley in the spring of 1888. Where he went is not recorded. He left the cabin more or less as he had found it, the iron arch still standing, the canvas replaced with a layer of split boards someone had donated over the winter, the fire properly banked. Mrs. Aldrich noted his departure in 2 sentences and no ceremony. But the arch stayed, and the principle inside it, the principle that a passive air gap with a controlled vent can compress months of natural seasoning into weeks, using nothing but differential temperature airflow geometry and the ambient heat of an adjacent wall. That principle stayed too. It traveled the way frontier knowledge always traveled, not through books or blueprints, but through observation and imitation and the quiet authority of a thing that worked when other things didn't. There is nothing complicated about what he built. The physics of wood drying are not exotic. Moisture moves from areas of high concentration to low concentration when there is airflow and a temperature gradient to drive it. A curved roof sheds snow load efficiently, the same reason arch bridges outlast flat ones. An enclosed chamber adjacent to a heated wall maintains a temperature buffer that significantly exceeds ambient outdoor conditions. None of this requires engineering credentials. All of it requires paying attention to how the physical world actually behaves. What made the Norwegian hand's solution remarkable was not that he understood thermodynamics. It was that he was in a situation where he could not afford not to understand it. Necessity did not make him a genius. It made him a careful observer of the problem directly in front of him. Modern builders still apply the same logic. Passive solar with drying structures, thermal mass walls, arc roof storage sheds, without necessarily knowing that a displaced millworker on the edge of a Montana settlement worked it out with salvaged iron rods and a canvas tarp in the autumn of 1887. The cold doesn't care about credentials. It never did. The arch, though, remembered everything. If this story made you see your firewood pile differently, give this video a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Every week we dig into a real frontier technique that worked when it mattered most. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to push through? We read every single one. This script is a historical reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. Technical details are based on plausible frontier-era conditions and vernacular building principles. This content does not substitute for professional engineering or building advice.